Well, tēnā koutou katoa. No America ho no te tematanga, ko te taita toku manga, ko waitaki toku awa, ko otatahi toku kainga inai nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Stephen mo toku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Well, everyone, it's wonderful to have you joining this session about community housing, and in particular, thinking about legal structures. We are really looking forward to this session. We were overwhelmed by the interest, and whether you're joining now live or you're watching the video later, we just want to say a welcome. And we already feel a bit of a kinship with you, because if you're interested in this sector, I think you're probably on the same page as us in wanting to see real change in our society. My name is Stephen Moe. I'm a lawyer at Perryfield Lawyers, a partner here, and I have a real focus on getting legal structures right to keep people safe. Ultimately, that's what I think we're here as lawyers to do, is to keep you safe. So my background, just briefly, is I am from America originally, but moved to New Zealand in 1983. So it's not that I'm 95 years old now, it's just that I was 7 years old when we arrived down in Otago, actually, near Amaru. So I became a lawyer, worked at a law firm called Russell McVeigh in Wellington, and I worked in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. And I'm now based in Perryfield Lawyers in Christchurch, Otatahi, but assisting clients across the country. So we're kind of agnostic as to location. And we have 80 people in our firm, and we have a real specialty within community housing, charities, getting the structures right, and helping people on that journey. So I'm really lucky to have two other partners in our firm joining me today, and I'm just going to ask them to each introduce themselves briefly. Judith, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So kia ora koutou. My name is Judith Bullin, and yes, I'm a partner here at Perryfield Lawyers as well. I have a real interest in community housing and property development, would probably be two of my big areas that I specialise in. My history is not quite as international as Stephen's. I grew up in a little town in Southland called Winton, and then went to Otago University, and then I've moved to Christchurch. I'm slowly making my way up the country. My first introduction to community housing was actually one of my first governance roles. A small local charity here in Christchurch I was a trustee of, and what this trust was doing was it built 11 social housing units in conjunction with another entity here in Christchurch, and provided these houses for 11 different whānau. So that really sparked a passion in me to be part of the sector, particularly seeing the impact that providing these homes had on these people. And it was a really great experience for me to be involved early on in my career, seeing a community housing project from start to finish, from acquisition of the land to applying for funding, the actual construction process, and then obviously housing these wonderful people. So yeah, that's sort of sparked my passion, and since then I've been quite involved in the sector in terms of providing legal advice to different entities who are embarking on this journey. Part of today's session, we're going to be focusing a little bit on the importance of partnering with other organisations, and one opening comment from me is just an encouragement that if you're in this seminar today and you are sort of early on in your journey, or you're finding that it's really hard to continue on, please don't give up. There are many organisations who are doing wonderful work in this space, and what we always find really encouraging is the purpose behind these organisations and their willingness to help other organisations trying to solve the issue of the real need for housing in our country. So yeah.
Yeah, it's my turn now. So I started at the top of the South Island and worked my way down, so the opposite to Judith. So I'm from Blenheim originally, and yeah, came down here, studied for law, joined Perryfield in about 2008 or no, 2009, and have been a partner here for sort of several years now. So my specialties in the property development sort of sectors and commercial as well. So particularly over the last few years, I've sort of worked a lot with clients who have been involved in this space, which has been very, very rewarding. And to echo some of the comments of Judith as well, I think where I've found it awfully exciting is actually hearing the stories of the people who have been able to, or where a need has been met and it's impacted someone's life, and it's something very, very special. And you probably don't get it a lot in the legal profession, where you can sort of see that impact and that purpose, that greater purpose. And from my perspective as well, where I've also found it awfully refreshing is just to see the collaboration amongst organisations involved in this space. And that's something very special, which I don't think you necessarily see in other areas as well. And certainly, yeah, it's been just a great part of getting to be involved in here. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we're going to have some discussions as we're going through about different topics, in particular, thinking about legal structures, thinking about things that you should be considering if you're looking at community housing. But we're really lucky because we're not just us organizing this event. We have been able to put into practice what we're saying and collaborate with others. So Community Housing Aotearoa is a great organization, and I've asked Chris Godell just to introduce what they're doing as well, because they're also involved in helping to organize this event. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Kia ora koutou, ko Chris Godell toko whenua. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive with Community Housing Aotearoa and Wharero o Aotearoa. And we're an incorporated society, and our members are the community housing providers. I see lots of familiar faces on the screen today, and it's great that everyone has been able to join us. And really a big shout out to Stephen, Judith, and Paul for their work on pulling together this guide and the other work that they do in support of charitable entities and those engaged in community and social housing. And for us with Community Housing Aotearoa and supporting our members and folks that are looking to establish housing trusts or some form of organization to provide community housing, some of the work that we do is really try to provide advice and guidance. And we're not lawyers, but we know lots of people and people to refer to. And so I guess where we can step in is just help you to think through some of the questions that you should be asking as you go through that process, and to think about what is the best structure. There isn't often a single right answer. It's really dependent on your circumstances. And the other thing that we can provide are referrals to some of the other great folks that are working in this field that may have similar types of entities or are trying to provide similar types of housing and services. So we can connect you, and you can make those direct connections to others who are already doing it, and really learn from those that have some broader experience and can help to guide you, or at least make sure that you're benefiting from their experience over time. So again, thank you, Stephen, for organizing this and having us along.
No, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and just endorsing what you're doing. It's awesome. We were at the recent conference that was held in Otatahi, Christchurch, and it was amazing because there was literally hundreds and hundreds of people gathered thinking about this need in our society and how we can best solve a crisis. So it's really good. Thank you. And I encourage you to check out their website. There's a lot of great resources. Speaking of which, I know you all know how to use the chat function, because you were telling me what the weather was like in your location before we started recording. So please use the chat. Paul, Judith, and I would love to have some difficult questions. You can send some easy ones too, but send us some of your difficult legal questions. What is it that's burning in your mind? We want this to be interactive, and we will leave time towards the end of the session to be able to address the questions in the chat. If for some reason we don't get to cover all the questions, because you're going to have so many amazing questions, what we'll do is copy paste them out, and we'll write up some answers, and we will send them out to you after the session. So feel free. This is your chance. Use the chat function well. And in the chat, I just put a link to our Community Housing Information Hub. So there's some videos there, there's some articles, there's information on our guide. Now, the other partner who's supporting this event is Community Finance. So James is on the call, but I'm going to save him for a little bit later, because we're going to be talking about financing. So James, hold on. wait a couple minutes because we would love to hear from you a perspective as a financer when it comes to community housing. But we're really grateful that Community Finance is able to support and be here as well. One disclaimer is that I've been the chair of Community Finance for the last 3 or 4 years, so I'm very familiar with the work that they're doing. So Paul, I want to start with you. What I would like to understand is vision. What are some of the questions that need to be asked if an organization is looking at community housing? What's the importance of vision?
Yeah, so it's a good starting point, isn't it, really? And that's what it does all start with is what's the organization's vision, and what's the purpose? What are you trying to achieve? What's the need that you're trying to meet? And the reason from our perspective why that's important is because once that vision is up and running, ideally from our perspective, from the lawyers' side of things, that's when you look to get in touch with us. Because the sooner that you're in touch with us, once you have that vision established, the sooner that we're going to be able to assist with some of those matters around what structure, what are you know, where are we heading with this? Some of the questions, I guess, that we see often pop up is, you know, is it affordable rentals you're trying to provide? Is it affordable housing? Is it a path to home ownership? What does that look like? Is it selling affordable houses? Is it progressive home ownership schemes? Are you wanting to provide wraparound services to support families? Are you wanting to make a more of a community feel? So there's a number of aspects to that vision which sort of once an organisation has that picture in their mind, that's when we can sort of look to jump in and start working. And as I said, I think the key takeaway was the sooner the better in a lot of ways. So.
Thank you. I think you're right. It comes back to the why, doesn't it? Like, why are we doing this? And you need to get that clear, because if you can be clear on your purpose and your why, then the questions about like which legal structure to use, a trust, a company, incorporated society, whatever, it's a lens that will help you to answer that question. So we have partners on this call, and one of the things that we're really interested in is hearing different perspectives. So David Monk has joined us from Home Foundation. David, can I just ask you a question on the importance of partnering? Maybe briefly what you're doing and what does partnering look like in your world?
Yeah, kia ora, Stephen, thank you. So my name's David. I work as part of the Home Foundation. The Home Foundation, we're sort of newcomers to this space. We've only been around for a couple of years in this space. Some of our team have been working in this space for a long time. But it means that when it comes to working, there's certainly a lot of things to learn. There's a lot of opportunities to kind of go in a whole bunch of different directions and expend a lot of energy. So I think becoming very clear about what we're doing and the unique value that we can bring, to Paul's point, and understanding how that sits within the ecosystem of what everyone is able to do has been certainly very important. It's pretty hard not to argue against partnership. I think in the non-emotional light of day, like, it makes sense to for all of us to get in our lanes and to work in the way that is best and adds the most value from our perspective. But I do think it's very easy to get into the trap and to fall into the trap, certainly in our culture, in the Kiwi culture, of just doing things ourselves or wanting to do things ourselves. And in our experience over the last couple of years, there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I think there's this idea that if you do it yourself, it's easier. And I think what's challenging about that is that there's a seed of truth to that. I think, when you're in control, you can just make things happen, and that's fine. But maybe there's a bit of a layup for a shameless plug later on, Stephen. There's a conference coming up which has a byline, something along the lines of, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. But certainly one of the other things that we've found as we've been talking over the last period of time and sort of meeting people and interacting with people in the space is that there is so much need, and that need can be all-consuming for people in their areas. And we're all passionate about helping them meet that need, and that's why we're here. And so as a result, we can become very tunnel visioned, to the need in front of us. it's something that we wrestle with a lot as an organization, making sure that we're not just so busy doing our own thing that we forget to interact with people around us, or that someone else down the road might be doing something that we are trying to do and they might be doing it even better than we could. So it makes sense to work with them. But it requires a lot of intentionality to make sure that you maintain that perspective and the opportunity to work with people. So certainly from our perspective, it's a wrestle that we always have. And the wrestle is always to find people that we can partner with, like-minded people. And there's certainly a lot of them out there for sure.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think we just wanted to ground our discussion because we're going to get into the legal structures, but just with some basic things like the vision, the purpose, and making sure that your ethos of what you're doing, because I think traditionally we would think, competition, but actually there's something about cooperation which unlocks a lot more potential. So thank you for sharing about that, David. Judith, we're going to come to you in a minute when we're thinking about legal structures, and that's really the heart of this session today. What are some of the legal structure options? What are some pitfalls to be aware of? But just before we talk with you, finances and money, let's put it on the table. Where are you going to get the money to be able to fundraise or to be able to implement your great idea? So James Palmer, I'm hoping that you're able to share a little bit on this. From my perspective, this comes back to a Jerry Maguire question. Do you know that movie from a couple of years ago? It's actually long ago now, where some of the younger generation probably don't know what you're talking about when you say Jerry Maguire. But in the movie, Tom Cruise was asked to shout, "Show me the money. Show me the money." And ultimately, in these projects, we need to be able to access financing. One of the interesting things that I'm seeing as a big shift, and I'll put it in the chat, is a move towards impact investing, where people are realizing that they can have an investment, they can get financial return, and they can have impact. James is online. He's from Community Finance. They're a partner with us for this event. James, do you mind explaining a little bit about what Community Finance is, and then any thoughts you have on this question of financing?
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, great to be here, and thank you, Parry Field, for this. This is a really important discussion in Mahi. Great to see so many familiar faces online, and also just want to acknowledge Community Housing Aotearoa as well for the great work you do. So yes, I think in simple terms, show me the money is a good way to encapsulate it, because it's such the barrier. It's so expensive to get a home in our country, which is why there is such great need. But that's why it's so expensive to try and combat that need. It's a sort of vicious cycle, isn't it? And the community housing sector is in the front line of helping those that often have less. And in a time when the economics don't stack up, it actually is really important to have these discussions around legal structures on how we finance things, because otherwise we can't help the people, which is what this is all about. And finance is often going to be 60 to 70% of the cost of each one of these homes. And when we look at even the waiting list for public housing, what is it, just under 25,000 whānau, it's depending on the cost of the build, 16 odd billion that we need as a country just for those people. So it's a staggering amount of money we need for our country and for our people. And so Community Finance was formed with a vision of how do you be the bridge between the fact we've never had more money as a country. So we've got about 250 billion of funds under management, and yet we've never had more need, ironically and tragically. And there are proven solutions, and many of them are the people on this call right now. So, back to David's point as well, how do we collaborate? How do we innovate? But also, how do we bring the best so that the commercials work? And our job then is to be a bit of a cheerleader for community housing providers and to go out to trust foundations, but mostly fund managers, and encourage them that if they're buying these things called bonds, why not a bond that's for the Salvation Army or Emerge or insert possibly your organization? And if we can do that at scale, and if we can do it at a lower cost, ultimately that means there's more people that get a home. So great mahi. And I was actually up at 4 a.m. this morning, which, if anyone knows me, is not when I'm at my best at all, but it was to go to a blessing with Emerge for 21 new homes. So that's what actually this conversation's about, isn't it? You know, when you get the right legal structures, you get finance, and you get people into home. And just as a quick shout out, with all of the Parryfield partners on this call, I've worked with other community housing providers, and can just say, as a lawyer, it's a pleasure to meet with those people that are experienced and care, and that's something that we need. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And the numbers change all the time, but I think it's up to about $135 million, which has been from funders, from KiwiSaver funders, philanthropic funders, then providing money that goes to community housing providers like Court, Emerge, Salvation Army. So really interesting, new, innovative business model when it comes to financing. Thank you so much, James, for being here and for sharing about that. Judith, we want to hear about legal structures. This is a call about community housing and legal structures. Now, I just want to note that you talked on this topic at the Community Housing Aotearoa conference, and the video of your talk is at the hub that's in the chat. But let's hear the download from you. What are some of the things that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. So what Paul and I are going to do is just run through a few different structures that we see, and we're not going to spend too long on them, because what we find is that once we hear your vision and your purpose and what you're trying to achieve, we can then tailor our advice to you and what structure might work for you. But we just want to give a general overview of what sort of structures are available, so that you can sort of have in your mind what things you need to be thinking about. Paul, did you want to start with limited partnerships first, and then I'll jump into some other structures?
Yep, no, that sounds good. So limited partnerships are a relative newbie, I guess, to the legal scene. They've sort of been around for, well, since 2008. The Limited Partnerships Act was legislated here in New Zealand, and they are becoming a bit more popular in terms of a structure. And probably a good way to describe them would be as a hybrid between a company and a partnership. So, and I'll go through some of the sort of the key points, but as Judith said, and the time we've got, it's very hard to go into too much detail. So, but the key point is that you have to have at least one general partner and one limited partner, and you can have as many limited partners as you want, really. The general partner is more or less akin to the directors of the company, so they drive the management. The limited partners would be the equivalent of your shareholders, and so they're often the ones who are putting forward the capital. They're the ones who are getting the return. And one of the perfect things with the structure is that there is that limitation of liability for those limited partners. They obviously put forward that capital, but in turn they don't have that liability. The liability rests with the general partner and with the limited partnership as a whole. And so what happens is the limited partnership gets registered. It's its own separate identity, its own separate legal personality, and the limited partnership is the entity which contracts with parties and can be sued or can sue people and those sorts of things. So that's quite an important point. The general partner can be liable jointly and severally along with that, the limited partnership as a whole. And so often that general partner is a company structure in itself, to sort of try and ring fence that liability there as well. One of the beautiful things with them is that they continue in existence. It's like a company. There's that perpetual succession until they're removed from the register or wound up by the parties involved. One of the key points is that you do have to have a partnership agreement in place, and so that's a requirement under the legislation, and that's often where lawyers will get involved with the review of those limited partnership agreements. And again, like all of this stuff, they are so bespoke to individual circumstances. I've noted down a few things that might get covered in them, but often things around exit strategies. You know, what happens if one of the limited partners wants to get out? What's their respective contributions to start with? What are their obligations? What's the obligations in respect of both the general partner and the limited partners? How income returns are allocated, those sorts of things. What happens on default? So there's a number of things, and I read something recently which sort of talks about, it's kind of trying to merge a partnership agreement with a constitution and try and pull the two together. So they can be sort of complicated, but they can be a useful structure depending on the circumstances, and possibly when you've got a number of different investors wanting to come into a project and maybe wanting to stay anonymous as well. The limited details of a limited partner don't get put out anywhere, so you don't know who the limited partners are. It's the general partner who's the face of the whole transaction or the whole organisation. So that's kind of a very quick summary of limited partnerships. So Judith, I'll fire back to you.
Yeah, great. Just while you were speaking, Paul, Chris from Community Housing has put a comment in the chat that limited partnerships are the most common structure used in America, with the low income housing tax credit program. So that's really interesting. He said non-profit organisations are the managing general partner and the investors who bring capital are the limited partners. And he says it works really well with that particular finance source. Thanks for putting that in there, Chris. So one other structure that we are starting to see a little bit more, and it might not be your overall structure, it might be a structure that you use for part of your project alongside another structure, is incorporated societies. So just a general overview of what an incorporated society is. It's a group of people who agree to be members, and they adhere to a set of rules that will sort of govern the purposes of that organisation. Often those members of that society would then appoint an executive committee or a committee who sort of run that incorporated society. So a couple of scenarios that we see this most commonly in would be where there is sort of a collaboration between different parties wanting to get a project up and running. So it could be a co-housing space or just some other type of collaboration between different members that want to be involved in the whole project. Another way we often see them is particularly in co-housing where there are sort of communal spaces or communal facilities, and an incorporated society might be the one that actually owns those facilities and runs those, and then the members would then be levied for the costs of maintenance and things like that, but they've also got a bit of a say on how they're run. Another way incorporated societies can come into play is shared services, so your water, your sewer, your driveways and things like that. It can be a really good way to try and manage how those costs will be dealt with. So while an incorporated society might not be your overall structure, sometimes you'll have different parts in your project that you think, how are we actually practically going to make this work with everybody that's living in this space? How are we going to ensure that it's managed fairly? And one way around that might be an incorporated society. Another structure I'll just briefly speak on is one that many people will be well familiar with, which a company structure. So companies are really popular, especially in the commercial world, to try and ring fence liability. So the company is a separate legal entity. It might be liable for the actual project. What some people don't know is that a company can be a charity as long as it is not for monetary gain. And Stephen will shortly talk about charities and charitable purposes and how to think through that. But what we often see is we would see a company structure set up to do the actual development, and then 100% of the shares might be owned by a charitable trust. And one rationale behind this is to try and ring fence liability for the actual development from the charity. And then another reason is that historically, and even today, companies are a really well-known structure. So when you go to sort of your mainstream banks or go to contract with a construction company, they know what a company is. When you start getting into different legal structures, sometimes banks and things can get nervous if they don't fully understand. So often people have been using companies just to have a well-known type of structure. But one thing that we're finding is that sometimes once we get involved, we'll be helping those who don't understand the structure involved. We'll be helping, say, the banks or anyone else you're contracting with to understand what your structure is and how that will practically work. So those are just a few structures. Stephen, did you want to talk now about charities?
I sure did. I get to talk about charities. Also, I see that there's some comments and some chat going on. So please continue that. At the end of the session, we are going to come back and see if there's any questions there that we can easily answer. So feel free to make use of that. It's great to see so many of you have joined. Some of you may have joined since we started. So in the chat, you can put your questions. So when it comes to charities and housing, there's a case which many of you will know, but I'm just going to briefly outline it and explain the situation. So if I could start with a blank piece of paper, I would make it easy for people who want to build community housing to register as charities, because I think it's fulfilling a charitable purpose. But unfortunately, they haven't put me in charge yet. So the situation is that there was a case about a decade ago, which, oh, thank you for the clapping there, Chris. Yeah, maybe, should I stand for the election? Definitely not. I think that the situation in the Queenstown Lakes decision, essentially it boils down to this. What they were doing was helping people into housing, but Charity Services and the court eventually agreed that the category of people that they were helping in were probably not the poor, you know, at the lowest levels in society. So there were criteria to become eligible to join the program. And if you looked at the numbers, you'd have to say on a national level, in Queenstown, maybe they're poor, but on a national level, these people are not what you could consider to be poor. Therefore, providing housing for them did not meet the criteria of reducing poverty. So it's kind of thrown into relief the fact that ultimately providing housing needs to be reducing poverty. So in the last year, our team has helped about 40 or 50 different entities register as charities. So we do this almost one a week. Like we're doing a lot. And that is pervasive, though, is when it comes to housing, it's harder to get them through as a charity, because there's going to be lots of questions around, well, who is eligible? How do they get criteria for if you qualify for the housing? And is the area that you're supporting, is it economically deprived? Or is that region actually quite high in terms of socioeconomic status and things? So the point of this story is that it is harder than you'd like to get in as a to get charitable status. So one of the ways, it is possible, though. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just that you need to work with selfless, you know, or selfish plug. You need to work with someone who knows the right way to describe what you do, a lawyer, and who can help you and guide you to get the charitable status if that's what you want. So you need to describe it. The way I would normally describe it is reduction of poverty, reducing poverty by providing housing for people who need it. And then you have to go and explain, okay, how do people qualify to become eligible? So that's usually a second set of questions that Charity Services will ask. The other thing I usually put in those purposes is something around education. So advancing education around the poverty of housing in New Zealand. So particularly for groups that have a bigger ambition, you know, why not prepare some white papers or case studies, have a website where information is available to help people on the journey of housing security. So that's kind of the basic position in terms of whether you can be a charitable or not. The one other thing to throw in at this point is that IRD will accept applications directly. So this is kind of skirting around becoming a charity. You can apply to the IRD directly as a housing provider, and you might be able to qualify for tax donee status. So you're not a registered charity, but you would get the good tax benefit despite that. So I think when I last spoke with Queenstown Lakes, they mentioned this to me in our guide that we need to have a section about that. And we're working on a part 2 for our guide where we will go into that in more detail. But I just want to throw that out as well. Like, there are multiple ways to approach this. The other thing that I want to say about charitable purpose is that it is possible to think a bit broader about what you're doing. So I've worked with some groups which are about regeneration of the land, native forest, planting, bringing back native birds, like the one sitting behind Judith, and having a focus on the environment in a charitable entity, and then having that charitable trust or charitable entity own 100% of a development company. And then the development company is working on providing housing solutions on that property. So that's another alternative way to be thinking about this. And that leads us nicely to the next part of this talk. Keep the questions, keep the comments coming in the chat. It's really helpful. And we value each of the wisdom of the people in this room. So we'd love to hear more comments and more information. But we thought, Judith, Paul, and I, we're just going to briefly share some thoughts in terms of examples. So the example that I just gave isn't a random made up one. I'm actually basing it on the Takaka co-housing project. So in the chat, I'll put a link to it. They are building, the first stage is 32 tiny homes just outside of Takaka on an ex-dairy farm. And they have planted it out in native forest. They're encouraging wildlife. There's a primary school quite nearby, so encouraging children to come and see the reforestation, the environmental work that's being done. So it's an example of something that may or may not have been on your radar, where they are doing housing, but it's through the lens of the environment and regeneration. So my challenge to some of you is, you're focused on social housing, but have you ever thought about the environmental aspects of what you're doing and starting to tell the story about a bigger picture? Of course, it depends on the land that you have and what's available, but it might be that could become part of your story as well and add even greater strength and weave in more bits of a story when it comes to community housing and social housing. So Judith, I'd love to hear any examples that you can think of.
Yeah, sure. So one type of housing that I've been quite involved in is in terms of progressive home ownership schemes or shared equity schemes. And they're becoming really quite popular, and I think for a really good reason. You often, I mean, James was giving us some figures before about the need and how much money is required to fulfill that need. On a smaller scale, often you'll hear about in the news the bank of mum and dad is required to help people get into homes and things like that. But for so many people, there's no bank of mum and dad. There's just, there's no finance there available. So progressive home ownership is becoming really popular as a way to help get people into home ownership. And basically a general overview of how this happens is your organisation might be the one that develops the property, or you might choose to purchase something that's already built. But what you will then do is you will go into shared ownership with a family, and you will together purchase this property. And the goal is that over time, who you've joined in with will be able to eventually own that home. So it's often a long-term project, but with a really exciting goal at the end. So if you're thinking about these schemes, some of the things that I think are really helpful to think about quite early on, just in terms of how you'll set things up and then how you'll market it to people, how you'll communicate to people that might be interested in your product, is the first one is who will be eligible for your scheme. Is it going to be someone that has a lot of financial hardship, or is it more that you're just trying to get people into your community, so as long as they're going to live in that community, they're eligible? There are lots of different things that you could be thinking about as to who might be involved, but just thinking through that is really important. How are you going to fund your portion of the equity? So bear in mind that before I just said often they're quite a long-term project. So you might be signing up to own 40% of this home for up to 25 years. How are you funding it initially? How are you going to keep funding it for 25 years? Is your goal to be able to get the money out sooner than that so that you can help others? Or are you comfortable with leaving money in for that long? In terms of that as well, just thinking through if you have got costs in terms of funding it, in terms of interest that you're paying and different finance costs there, is that going to be built into what this other party has to pay you? Are there going to be some fees that need to come back and things like that? So just getting some really good guidance and understanding of how this long-term project is going to work and how it's financially going to impact you, because I think it's really important that you think really widely about who are you wanting to help, how are you going to help them, and 25 years is a long time away. What things can you be thinking about now to make sure that those structures are working well? Just some other things to think about is control of the property. So while you're a shared owner with someone, are you wanting to be in control of the maintenance and the insurance and all that kind of thing to make sure everything with this property is done the way you would like it to be done? Or are you wanting to pass over that control to the other party so that they can start getting a real sense of responsibility of home ownership and all that comes with, and yeah, really help them on that journey. So it might be something that you start off with control with, but as they start owning more, they will have a bit more control of that. And then Paul early on mentioned about wraparound services, and sometimes what we see is having these wraparound services built into this progressive home ownership scheme. So being part of this, one condition is that you will be part of the wraparound services, which might be upskilling them in terms of financial literacy, how to look after a home, all the responsibilities that come with owning a home. And so that can be a really great way in terms of education and things like that as well. You also just need to start thinking about, okay, it's a 25-year-long program. What happens if someone's circumstances change? It might be someone passes away or their financial position changes substantially that they just won't be able to manage this. Are you as an entity going to be in a position to buy out their share? Or do you need to build up a buffer so that just in case? Or would you be willing to go into the scheme with someone else who's eligible? Or is it going to be a case of having to sell to a third party and then starting again? So it's just thinking through a lot of these things to try and understand, yeah, what it is that you're trying to achieve, how you might achieve it, and just thinking through a lot of the what ifs, and we often help with that. I just want to encourage on the HUD website, they've got a section about progressive home ownership schemes, and it's actually got a whole lot of useful information. There's a whole lot of webinars explaining the different ways that you might be able to do this and how to do some modelling and things like that. So would really endorse you to go and have a look at that website. They also have a fund for progressive home ownership providers, so private organisations, and there's some information there about how you can apply for that fund. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I'd endorse having a look through there. And then one other option is a rent to buy scheme, and it's quite similar to progressive home ownership in that they the party comes in with you, they get to live in the home, and then they're working towards their end goal of owning the property. With this one, they rent to start with, and part of their, say it's weekly rental payment, that will all get set aside to help them pay down what is owed to own that property. It's another fantastic scheme, another way of helping people get to their goal. And I think it can be really rewarding being part of that, because, you know, each week you can celebrate, hey, you've now paid this amount off, you're this much closer to owning this home and this being all yours. So it's, yeah, it is a really fantastic scheme. Just being aware that the CCCFA comes into this, and so you just need to be aware of your obligations under that. There are some quite onerous obligations in terms of making sure that whoever you're entering into the program with can financially afford it. You've got some registration that you need to do and compliance you need to do. So if you're wanting to go down this track, getting early advice on that so you can make sure this is actually possible for us to be registered and possible for us to comply with this legislation, both in terms of your structures and also making sure that, you know, you the costs involved in terms of keeping compliant, that you're factoring that in, because it can be onerous. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for the comments in the chat. That's really awesome. Judith, there's one that you could probably answer or find the link to. Nikki said, can I have the link to the HUD site? We will follow up this session with an email out, including a link to the video, because we're aware that some people in your organization may have benefited from being able to, listen to this and hear the conversation. So also thank you, everybody. This is great to see. The chat is lighting up at the moment, lots of different comments. And I love some of you have put in some examples of projects that you've seen. So I think that's really important. It's good to share stories of the highlights and what's going on. So thank you for sharing those. And we are going to come back to the questions, but I have something, Paul, I need your input. What about development? When it comes to development, what are some of the key things that our friends on the call need to be thinking about when they come to the actual nitty-gritty of developing?
Sure. Yeah, it's a big topic, Stephen. But the first and most important thing is due diligence on the bit of land that you find. So you found a property that you want to acquire, and it's fundamentally important to ensure that you've got you've undertaken a thorough due diligence before committing to the purchase. And where that really starts, and some of the takeaways, I guess, is that again, it's just really important to liaise with a lawyer as soon as you can. Really, if you find a block of land and you think this is a block of land that I want to buy, this is the one that we think is going to work for us, it's going to fit with our purpose and with our vision, then it becomes important to get the mechanics of the contract established and to make sure that they protect your position. And so a due diligence clause in these contracts is really a simple way to be able to sort of try and achieve that. And so that allows you to be able to undertake a thorough investigation of the land to make sure it's going to serve the purpose. There's no restrictions or anything impediments to you being able to carry out your development of the same. And the beauty with the due diligence clause is that it also allows you wider scope, not just to look at the land, but to bring in other professionals as well, other advisors, because it is quite a team effort. It's not just lawyers who need to be involved, but it's your accountants right from the get-go. And I saw a comment pop up before, which I agreed with, that having a good accountant and having them advising and interacting and running what you're hoping to do with them is so key to this whole dynamic as well. And particularly, I guess, from a properties perspective, with how you deal with things like GST and how that gets treated on the transaction when you buy the land, and then depending what you do moving forward, whether you sell it or whether you lease it, how that impacts on things is really important. Some other key advisors would be planners and surveyors and engineers. So, if you've got a block of land that this looks good, you don't know what you don't know. And really, it's about trying to find out, okay, are there any council restrictions on us being able to develop this land? Getting in touch with the planner early on is key. Getting in touch with the surveyor is actually practically going to work for us to be able to put the number of units on that we want to put on here. What's it going to look like? Pulling those things together is really, really, really important. Engineers, particularly from Christchurch's perspective, over the last 10 or 12 years, having a geotech engineer as investigating ground conditions has always been an absolute must, and I suspect it's the same around a lot of the country as well. But one of the key other aspects is you've really got to allow yourself enough time to be able to complete a thorough due diligence. And so, some of the projects that I've been involved in, you're well into the months of time to be able to collate all of the reports and really to give yourself sufficient time and collate enough information to be able to decide, is this actually the right property for us? Because once you commit, once you go unconditional, there's no turning around, there's no going back. So it's about making sure that you've ticked all your boxes, that it's the right property before you go ahead. And then, of course, once you do acquire the land, the next step is the development phase. And again, it's one of the big aspects that we often get involved with is there's two parts to that, really. Construction contracts, we'll often be reviewing those, working through that process, and the subdivision process as well. So again, that's us liaising with the surveyor in order to obtain the new titles, depending if that's where you're heading. If you're looking at building multiple units where you're going to separate them out and have separate titles. What I'll just move to, though, I think is the on sale of units or the leasing of the units. So for a lot of developers, they'll go through that process of building, and then they'll possibly on-sell. And it might be that their goal is to on-sell to people in the affordable housing space. So making sure they are affordable homes in terms of pricing and those sorts of things. And so again, it's about making sure you've got fairly comprehensive further terms of sale that get included in any sale contract. Often you're entering into those contracts well before completion. So at a time, maybe even before you've started putting in foundations and those sorts of things. And so technically people are buying off the plans. And so it's about making sure that you've got coverage in there for variations to anything which might pop up through the subdivision process, something which Land Information New Zealand or the local council might raise and say this needs to change. So the contract's got to be flexible enough for you to be able to go to buyers and say, sorry, this is changing. Same with your construction in terms of your plans and specifications, building into your contract the ability to be able to sort of change those plans and specs as things come up. Obviously we saw over COVID issues with supply chains and everything like that. And so for a lot of builders, it was having to go back to their contract and say, well, actually, sorry, we can't now provide that specific item. Here's something which is similar. And knowing that the purchaser, at the end of the day, they've signed a contract which says that that's okay. So making sure those sorts of things are covered. And one of the big things which I've struck in the last few years is when you're on selling is often there might be a block of land which is within a recent subdivision which could be developed further. And so often those blocks of land may have been earmarked for subdivision and sale as affordable homes and those sorts of things. And sometimes on the underlying title, there's actually an instrument which is registered which protects that. And so it stops a developer coming in and just selling them to anyone at whatever price they like. It's got to be sold at an affordable price. And so it's really important to sort of get your lawyer to check those aspects as well, because something from there may need to actually show up in the agreement. And I've seen situations, for instance, where the local authority put a consent notice on the title and said, well, these units, this block will be subdivided into 12 units, and each of those units must be sold at an affordable price. And so before we will release this consent notice, we've got to get a statutory declaration from the purchaser as well as the developer to say it's been sold at this price and it's going to be used by that person as their main home. And so that had to be included in the contract. So there's all sorts of sort of quirks like that as part of the process. And just quickly, I guess from my perspective, where I've seen this happen a wee bit as well, is developers have either built apartments or built units and those sorts of things, and then they've wanted to lease one or more to community housing providers. And so it's such a cool thing, because obviously the community housing providers have got access to the list of people who are in need, and they can make work with the developers to be able to get those people into these houses, which is really, really critical, really big part of this whole picture, I guess, of trying to meet this need. And so obviously from my perspective, where I have seen it done, it's been based on a relatively standard sort of commercial lease as between the developer and the community housing provider, and that obviously has allowed then the community housing provider to on lease or sublease to the people in need, to the families who need a place to live. From the perspective, just a couple of quick points on that, because I see we're sort of starting to run short on time. Some of the things that we often see in those leases very much gets tied back to the services agreement that the community housing provider enters into with HUD to be eligible for the income related rent subsidy. So often things like how rents are determined often link back to how HUD might determine those rents within that contract. Some things to think about, I think, if you're a developer looking at those things, would be, making sure that you're not subject to the Residential Tenancies Act in respect of your relationship with the community housing provider, but obviously acknowledging as well that they will then be subject to that Residential Tenancies Act in terms of the subleasing. Things like there'll be clauses in there which provide that, you will be, normally a commercial landlord actually has to give consent before someone can sublease. But in this case, it's going to be a key part of the whole transaction that the community housing provider can sublease. So often there's clauses in there which say, yes, they're allowed to sublease. depending as well on when you're entering into the lease and where the project is in terms of the development, there can be timing around the commencement of the lease. So it's about working with the community housing provider to make sure, okay, the dwelling is going to be completed on this date, but we're still waiting on new titles and code compliance certificates and those sorts of things. And so commencement date might be triggered by the issue of a code compliance certificate. So there's a number of different aspects to that. That's just a few brief ones. But I guess the key point is, as always, this is all so bespoke, and it's really going to depend on the parties, the nature of the development, all these different areas as to what goes in and informs these documents. So that's a very, very, very quick overview
That's awesome.
of that. So yeah,
it's unfortunately, lawyers, you probably get tired of lawyers saying this, but it depends, right? Like it really does depend on the situation. So what we're going to do now is have a very rapid fire Q&A. So Judith, Paul, and myself, we're just going to look at some of the chat questions, and I'm going to ask the question, and then maybe the two of you can just initial thoughts. We don't want the 5-minute version. We want the 30-second version because I want to get through a couple before we finish up. So Nikki's asked a great question. What sort of insurance, if any, should a trust and trustees in a housing development trust have? Any thoughts from either of you on insurance?
Yeah, so really important to have insurance. So Nikki, if your trust is an incorporated trust, then your individual trustees possibly don't have personal liability, but it's still really important to have insurance for both your trust and your trustees. What we could do is possibly put you in touch with a couple of insurance brokers who might be able to guide you through that process and look at the different options that are available. So we will try and flick you some more information on that, Nikki.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe for you, Paul. Holly. Hi, Holly. Nice to see that you're here. How are rent to own and equity options affected by the Bright Line tests?
Oh, that is a very good question, which I actually don't know the answer to off the top of my head. Judith, do you know that one?
Yeah. So the rent to own one, once people own a portion, then if they were to sell, then yes, Brightline tax will be currently will be important there. For the actual entity that has set it up, then yes, Brightline tax will still be relevant and it won't be their main home, so they won't have that exemption. But if you are a charitable trust or a charitable organisation that has income tax exemptions, then this possibly won't actually impact you at all, because the way Brightline test works, the tax on it is that any gain that you make gets added onto your income and then you're taxed accordingly. So for some organisations, it won't actually impact that much.
That's great. And I want to acknowledge Chris from Community Housing Aotearoa, because he's been chatting, typing away there. It's great to see. People are asking, like, who should I contact in this region? And he's like, contact this person. So it just shows you the value of reaching out if you do have questions. That's really awesome. Tracy's got a comment there as well. I don't know your thoughts on this. Ecology reports are also very important because the RMA has gotten even tighter. Any reflections on that point?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah. I think that's quite important to be looking through that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Cool. Well, what we'll do is we'll go through the chat and we will see if there's other ones that we haven't answered, and we'll do our best to answer them in a follow-up email. But we want to make sure we keep to time. Oh, Chris, have you got a raised hand there? Did you want to say something?
Just a quick one on insurance, especially where you're entering into lease agreements and then subleasing. Make sure that that is disclosed to the property owner's insurance company. It is a big mess right now. A lot of insurers don't like it when properties are sublet. And so it's something you really, really need to make sure that your insurer is aware and has approved what you're doing. We're currently working with the Insurance Council of New Zealand to try and sort through issues. But you don't want to be caught out to find out that the property that you're leasing no longer has insurance once a claim is filed.
Great points. Thank you. That's really good. Well, yeah, we do want to keep to time, so we want to say thank you, everybody, for joining. In terms of follow-up, there's maybe a couple things that I'll mention, and Judith and Paul, you can jump in if you think of anything else. The first one is, I'd already emailed this out. This is the Community Housing Legal Guide, so you should have a PDF of that. If it's helpful, then probably someone else you know would find that it's helpful. So feel free to forward it on to other people. Our intention behind it is to really resource this sector. We are the leading law firm in community housing, and we want to make sure that you all have the resources that you need. The other thing is, I attached to the email reminder of this call something that's called the Charities Health Check. So if any of you are charitable or you have charities as the heart of what you do, this has been co-created with 100 people who gave me feedback on an initial list I had. So there's now 6 different guides. So if you'd like a copy of them, you can just drop me an email. There's lots of different topics there. And the other thing is that we are starting our email list. And so everyone who's on this call or has signed up, we will be emailing from time to time. We won't commit if it's going to be how often, but we will send updates regarding housing and community housing, social housing from time to time. So be watching out, and we will try to host this type of thing in the future. If you found it helpful, maybe drop us a line. If we thought we should cover some other things, maybe drop us a line. I'm aware that there's other things that we couldn't touch, like cooperative housing as an example. We didn't really get into land-based trusts as an example. There's many other topics. Governance, we didn't get the chance to talk about what we would expect from governance. So I think there's plenty that we can talk about. And if Judith and Paul are keen, then we might organize something later on in the year. So be watching out for that. But like I said at the start, we're a law firm that is trying to do things differently. We have 80 people supporting across property, corporate, commercial, community housing, disputes. And we would love to talk with you if that is something that you need support in. We have a real specialty in that area. Judith or Paul, any last thoughts or things that you wanted to say?
Yeah, just one last comment from me. I've been really encouraged today. I started off by saying how important it is to partner with others, and David spoke on that as well. And just seeing the chat, how everyone's so willing to help each other with their questions, really encouraging. So if you've needing help, do let us know, and there might be contacts that we have, or perhaps that Chris has, where we can put you in touch with the right people to help you with your purpose.
Awesome. No, I agree entirely. I think that was great. Thanks, guys.
That's great.
Thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming and for the messages that we're seeing popping up. Yeah, we really enjoy doing this type of thing. I hope that you get the sense of the type of people that we are, and the heart behind why we're involved in this sector. All of us are on LinkedIn, so if you want to connect with us, speaking for the other two, that's fine. We're happy. We try to post things from time to time. So let's keep up this idea of cooperating, supporting, and having in mind a greater purpose than just the individual organization or the individual initiative. So thanks for joining, and have a great rest of your day.